Hey everyone, this is Ben Norton, and this is part two of the Empire and the Deep State series that I'm doing with Aaron Good, author of the very important book, American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. And as always, we're joined by our co-host, Seamus McGuinness. In the first part of the series, we gave a very basic kind of overview of the kind of theoretical foundations of the model that Aaron has laid out in his book of the tripartite model of the state. What is the deep state? And we talked about what inspired him to theorize this and the idea of lawlessness and the decline of democracy. In this episode, what we're going to do is do basically a history of the U.S. deep state, going back to the formation of the United States as this colonial project up to today. I mean, it's a pretty ambitious undertaking. I think we're going to be able to accomplish it in about an hour here. And of course, we're going to have other episodes in the future providing much more nuance and information about certain periods in this history of the deep state, right? Especially, we'll focus on World War II and the Bretton Woods system. We'll focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll focus on Bay of Pigs. We'll focus on Watergate. We'll focus on JFK. We'll have separate episodes about all those things. But what we're going to try to do today is outline a very rough history of the U.S. deep state. And Aaron, I wanted to begin this part talking about another important concept in your book that is foundational to understanding this analysis of the U.S. empire and the deep state, and that is your concept of exceptionism, which is not the same thing as exceptionalism, the idea, that the U.S. is the greatest country on earth, this very, patriotic kind of chauvinist idea. You have a very different definition of exceptionism, which is related to this idea we were speaking about in the first part of lawlessness. And of course, the deep state being built on this idea of covert lawlessness and its links to the state. So explain what you mean by American exception and exceptionism, and that can help root our understanding today of the history of the deep state.
Right. Well, the term, the exception, comes from Carl Schmitt, who is notorious for being the legal theorist behind Nazi Germany. And he was writing at the time of the Weimar Republic, and he wrote that in times of extreme peril, you have the need for emergency measures. And so writing about the sovereign, who is actually sovereign, he wrote, "Sovereign is he who decides the exception." The exception being the exception to the rule of law when the state is empowered to act in whatever ways it sees fit in order to protect the state from existential threats. And in the 1920s, that existential threat, due to the terrible settlement of World War I, was, and the economic crises that it brought on to Germany, that threat was the threat of a socialist revolution. And so he is writing with an implicit understanding that the oligarchy of capitalism is the state. That's important to mention when you talk about Schmitt and this idea of the exception. It wasn't as though Germany was really at risk of not having any kind of government. It's that Germany was at risk of having a government that would sweep away the prevailing oligarchy, regime, establishment of Germany and replace it with one that was socialist. And so the entire ruling class, and then the people who work for the ruling class, like legal theorists, they are mobilized against this. And Schmitt comes out with his idea of the exception, which argues that you need to protect the state at all costs, and that in times of emergency, leaders need to pursue this. And this is not just a neoconservative, or what we would think of today as a neoconservative or a right-wing point of view. We associate it with the Nazis, but it gets down to a fundamental question, which we'll get deeper into in later chapters. But in a liberal society, when can the state act with emergency powers? Now, in America, in the U.S., after World War II, the idea of the state of emergency was pretty much enshrined as extant foreign policy grand strategy, that the U.S. was in a twilight struggle against the global communist conspiracy, and that any methods that would be used to avail the U.S. in this struggle would be justified on the basis of the emergency that they were faced with. And so exceptionism is the term that I use to describe the institutionalization of state lawlessness, more or less. And this is obviously different from American exceptionalism. It doesn't, you could argue that, I could say it doesn't derive from that word, but it's meant to sort of ironically invoke that term of American exceptionalism, because the American exceptionalism that we think of is that America is somehow special from every other country, that other countries might pursue things. I mean, Obama even says things like this: other countries wanted to go out and expand their territory, but we don't seek an inch of anybody else's land because we're different. We're America. And this begins with, you could maybe trace it back to John Winthrop, right? The city on a hill, a shining city on a hill. And then Reagan takes that concept. And, it was by virtue of the enormous resources that the U.S. had, and a culture and organizational models of business and governance that came from England and a Europe where polities were in competition and war with each other and had to become more and more efficiently organized, and it propelled technology, this constant state of war in Europe over centuries, that when you transport that kind of a system to the U.S., they're far advanced and very much more efficient than the societies that are living here of indigenous people. And so it's kind of a foregone conclusion that the Europeans are going to take over North America, especially Latin America to some extent too. But it's, the North American situation, you see this. And America, because it's like basically an offshoot of Britain, they are they're very powerful with a lot of resources, and they take over. They go from sea to shining sea, and they consider themselves like the greatest country on earth. They win. They come in on the winning side in both world wars, and this contributes to Americans' sense of like how great they are. And so these myths of American greatness and exceptionalism exist, and they kind of obscure the reality of it, which is not democracy and so-called free enterprise prevailing and creating prosperity for everyone, but it's actually an empire just like any other empire, which isn't to say it's exceptionally horrendous as an empire in terms of its actual fundamental basis. It is horrendous, exceptionally horrendous in terms of the power that the U.S. had. I mean, empires are empires, and they share a common disregard for the humanity of subjected peoples. And that goes for the U.S. and other empires as well. But the difference with the U.S. is its enormous amount of power. And another difference might be that it denies that it's an empire. And exceptionism allows the U.S. to continue to deny that it's an empire, although who really believes that now, you really would wonder, because the sort of the more gangsterish things are done covertly oftentimes. Not always. You still have us dropping napalm in Vietnam or the Iraq War and so on. But a lot of things are done covertly so that we can say that we didn't do them and try to maintain this halo for ourselves. And since the media pretty much serves the same forces that animate the empire, they go along and they share cover stories as gospel. I mean, that's the real fake news that we've got to worry about, is the fake news that obscures exceptionism, the criminality of the state. And so exceptionism is a key part of the tripartite state, and it really gives the deep state a veto power over democratic threats to its hegemony over state and society. So this exceptionism is key.
So turning to, in chapter 1, you give sort of a broad genealogy of the American deep political system. And as we've already discussed some of slavery. You mentioned Samuel Zemurray, who started Cuyamel Banana Company, which would become United Fruit. You also mentioned the sugar industries. So if you just want to give a broad outline, because there tends to be a lot of the descendants of this end up being people like you mentioned. Henry Cabot Lodge is descended from Boston Brahmins who were involved in the opium trade, and even as Greg Polgrain writes in JFK versus Dulles, Allen Dulles, who is, could be argued as being one of the biggest, opium traffickers, if you see his organization as backing it, is descended from either, I believe his name's Joseph Dulles, and he's either, they can't figure it out, but in what is now Indonesia, is one of the biggest either opium or slave traders of that era. So there is a lot of descendants in the deep political system as we know it in the CIA era. But prior to that, what is sort of the genesis of the American deep political system, and how does it sort of lead up to from a privatized realm to more of a political realm before it becomes the federal level, with we see things like a political machine? So just sort of a broad overview. Curious how that came to be.
Well, the tripartite state, its three components, do have origins that you can trace back to the beginnings of English colonialism in the United States. So the public state, you have like the House of Burgesses and these different colonial governments before independence that were based along the same lines as prevailed in England. And this is the public state in the United States. This is where you had political decisions arrived at through some amount of consensus and public debate and participation in some ways, even though it was always limited who it would be. You did have like elements, democratic elements and public elements of the system of government. And you also had a security state, which was the different militias that were organized, especially to defend the frontier. And you could say that the English administration, which had a kind of a veto power and access to British military, that this was like part of the security state that prevailed during that time as well. But you also had private power in the colonial era and in the early, U.S. era. And these are often related to commercial ventures that some of the most important economic developments in the United States were related to illicit or semi-illicit economies, things that would later become outlawed, especially the slave trade and the opium trade. So the opium trade is very big in New England in terms of who was financing this, and they were able to take Turkish opium and sell it to China because the British weren't allowed to sell Turkish opium. They were only allowed to sell British opium because of some weird mercantilist regulations that they had put into their government. And so this gave an avenue for Americans to get in on the opium trade in China by working with Turkish opium. And this was a case where, okay, the laws in the US weren't set up against it, so you could say it's not organized crime. But in order to do this, they had to work with people in China who were part of the Chinese underworld, because it wasn't, they tried to crack down on these things in different ways, and they had to have these different go-betweens that were connected to organized crime. And this money came to endow major universities like Yale University, came to be used to build one of the first railroad in the U.S., the first industry in the North, the Lowell Mills, which kids learn about when they're in school. That gets financed by opium. They don't really put that in U.S. high school history books, but it was opium that financed that. And so, they also profited from the slave trade. So the 1619 people at New York Times would say that they would point out that since the North, they would try to argue that since the North benefited from the slave trade, that this must be like the main reason behind like the revolution and other things, which is overstating it. But there was that big slave economy, and it was very lucrative. I mean, the two most lucrative things in the early U.S. Were opium and the slave trade, things related to slavery, and the cotton trade as well, based intimately connected to slavery. And this also gives rise to American industry. So the first industry in the United States, just like it was the first industry in Britain, was the textile industry. And as I said, financed by opium money to build these Lowell mills where especially women would work in the textile industry. And that is the beginning of a sort of mechanized, primitive, but still mechanized modes of production in the U.S. And exactly the kind of industries that the colonial masters from Britain did not want the U.S. to have. This is why there's really more reasons for the revolution than just slavery. The U.S. had a class of people that didn't want to be deeply indebted and providing just raw materials forever for Britain. And so mercantilist policies also fueled the revolution in the United States, the Revolutionary War for Independence. It's not a real revolution. And so these illicit political economies are intertwined with industrialization. And later you have foreign investment. And foreign investment that's more lucrative is always involves a bit of coercion and violence and so on. So the fruit and sugar industries, talked about Sam Zamuri, but all the sugar people in Cuba, and I mean Haiti. Look at Haiti. What was Haiti? Why was Haiti so lucrative for the French? It was where all the sugar was made and produced, and this was the most valuable colony that the French had. And in fact, the Louisiana territory was really only useful to the French because it supplied foodstuffs for slaves in Haiti. And so once they lost Haiti, when Toussaint Louverture, right, when he rises up and they have that revolution in Haiti, slave revolt that succeeds, Napoleon doesn't really have much use for Louisiana, so he sells it to finance his other wars, right? But this is but it was so much violence that was used to run Haiti. I mean, this slave regime, it was combustible because you had so few white people overseeing this massive slave force that eventually it collapses on itself. And the sugar industry later would be dominated by mafia-connected people. So when other U.S. people's interests set up sugar plantations in Cuba, the mob worked there as well because the mob could set up casinos and havens for drug trafficking too, if need be. But also, the mob would provide goons to stop any sort of organized labor or populist movement or democratic movements that might get in the way of what the companies wanted. In Nicaragua under Somoza, that was a huge deal there. The mob was very connected to the Somoza regime, which was connected to other United States elites. I mean, there's that famous quote from Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was not, he had the good neighbor policy, which wasn't just PR, and he was opposed to colonialism, but he also recognized the realities of U.S. history and European history and colonialism. So he has that quote about Somoza: "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." And you could say that's meant that paints FDR in a more predatory light than liberals like to think of him, or you could see him as explaining away that sort of thing and wanting a slight change in policy. I see him as being progressive and not really in the mold of like the post World War II imperialists, but that's I guess a whole different subject.
Well, a quick note on that, Aaron. I mean, you mentioned the case of Nicaragua and the Somoza regime's ties to the mafia. Well, also the Batista regime in Cuba was very closely linked to the mafia. And for people listening, I mean, they probably have seen Godfather Part 2, this classic movie. And there's a scene where the U.S. mafia is meeting in Cuba and they have this cake with the image of Cuba on the cake, right? Like an icing. And then they slice up the cake representing Cuba and give a piece to everyone in that meeting. I mean, it's a very clear cinematic representation of the links between this kind of U.S. colonial regime in Cuba and the U.S. organized crime networks. But just I didn't want to interrupt your thought, but you also mentioned FDR, and we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Delano family and opium.
Yeah, that's where their fortune came from. The John Kerry, he's like John Forbes Kerry, right? The Forbes family is opium. So I mean, the affinity between gangsters and capitalists has been there historically, and it's not hard to see why. They're businessmen and they exploit people to make a profit. In whether you're a corporation or you're a criminal syndicate. So it's really the affinity between these groups when you stop and think about it and you just set aside your kind of American social conditioning or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense actually. So that's that. If you have that frame of mind, then it's not that hard to understand. Like, gosh, was like Rockefeller and other Wall Street types? Why were they trying to like reestablish the drug connection in the Golden Triangle right after World War II? But if you get that. They're always kind of intertwined informally before World War II. And the intelligence services, the post-war national security state, really just institutionalizes these things, including these darker elements like collaboration with the mafia. This comes about, and it's a big pillar of the American deep state. And the other families up there, like the Russell Trading Company, they sponsored. They pay for the Skull and Bones. They like have an endowment. They gave Yale all of its land, and they endowed Skull and Bones with a certain amount of money so it could exist. And these guys go on a lot disproportionately to work in like intelligence and other other higher circles. And, people want to mystify some of these secret societies, but I think in general, they represent, wealth and cliquishness, collaboration,
and social
for oligarchic elements. Yes.
It's social reproduction. This is how the oligarchy reproduces itself.
Right. Exactly. And so this is, and it's not a random coincidence. It may be ironic, but it's also not a coincidence that the Skull and Bones, for example, is endowed by opium traffic, because when it comes down to it, like oligarchy and in any civilization, your oligarchs and your political economic elites are the people who are in a position institutionally to be able to accumulate the surplus of the economy without putting in requisite amount of work, that they're able to have a position that allows them to accumulate work and thereby exploit people by doing very little, and that's the situation the position that you want to be in. That's the essence of being an elite in civilization. Is you don't have a job like basket maker or farmer. That your job is to maintain your hegemony and your privileged position vis-a-vis the rest of society. And these are fundamental questions to civilization. And the American, experience represents one way that has played out. I mean, you can't, it doesn't explain everything, but class, the whole of history as class struggle is something that does actually hold pretty true. And you can look at things that way. It's not helpful to think that everything is that, and that is the only thing you should ever look at. But it's important to note that this is a fundamental problem of civilization, is the power of elites and the surplus of the economy and the extra wealth that it generates. And these illicit economies can generate a lot of wealth and power, and they do. And the people at the very top always find ways in a capitalist society to incorporate this. I think I mentioned this on your show, Ben, but it was very funny when Joe Rogan said, like, man, that the banks are somehow involved with the drug trade, because like they're just not going to leave that money laying on the table. And when the financial crisis happened, it turns out that that's what kept the economy afloat, was hot money. And it only becomes noticeable when all the other money stops. But of course, it's accumulating all the time. And who's really getting all that money? And so this is the basis of this oligarchy in the United States. And it propels the U.S. to expand from sea to shining sea. The frontier acts as an outlet for extra labor and other problems for the United States. But then once they do get from sea to shining sea, the U.S. keeps going. And that is the U.S. empire that begins in the early 1900s or late 1890s, this international empire. And these sort of globally minded elites eventually are able to affect America's entry into World War I, and decisively, and in a way that really wasn't in the best interest of American democracy, the American people, but it was in the best interest of J.P. Morgan and other Anglophile elites. And that sets the stage for World War II and the U.S. entry into World War II, which further aggrandizes the state and causes more organization of the military and massive industrial production really solves the Depression. And it was planned by these people that they would go for a global empire. And that episode is really important. The fateful U.S. decision to not just expand like Spanish-American War style or dollar diplomacy style into Latin America, or with saddling Europe with debt like after World War I, but that they're going to actually go for the holy grail of hegemony after World War II. This is a fateful moment, and it gives rise to the deep state.
Yeah, well, I really want to talk about that period. It's extremely important, but to kind of just go chronologically, I do want to go back a little bit to the 18th and 19th centuries. But before I do that, just because you mentioned Skull and Bones, Aaron, I mean, not only is it, of course, closely linked to intelligence and the opium trade, but of course, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention that they have long been accused of secretly harboring the skull of Geronimo, the indigenous leader, which, there has been debate about, but just the fact that it's so clearly associated with the remains of an indigenous leader, also for me, it's the symbol of how this U.S. capitalist oligarchy is so deeply linked to the drug trade and the CIA and the genocide of indigenous peoples. I should add that there have been allegations which are, I think, there's a lot of debate about whether or not they had Geronimo's skull. I think it's actually, there's more evidence for that. There isn't much evidence, but there have been accusations for them having Pancho Villa's skull. Pancho Villa was, of course, one of the main leaders of the Mexican Revolution. So, I mean, for me, it really just, again, reflects that kind of, colonial context that a lot of these elite organizations are situated in, and how they're closely linked to organized crime. But, on the subject of organized crime in the state, and on the subject of Mexico, in your book, you talked about the opium trade and the slave trade and sugar. But I also want to briefly address two other examples that you discuss in your book, which are, of course, the expansionist policies and attacks on indigenous peoples in the United States, and the Barbary pirates. So you point out, three examples, and the Mexican-American War, which is related to U.S. expansionism, of course. So you point out in your book here that early in U.S. history, the security state was more securely tethered to the public state, and it was used in instances like you mentioned the Barbary pirates, attacks on American Indians to promote expansion, as in Andrew, and then this is also very important, Andrew Jackson's attack on Spanish Florida, Polk's Mexican-American War, basically stealing half of northern Mexico. And you point out that the cases of Florida and Texas are very relevant because no official authorization was given to Andrew Jackson or the Texas rebels. And you say that their actions clearly seem to have emerged from deep political forces. And then you, of course, talk about Andrew Jackson's negation of the treaties with Native peoples. So maybe briefly you could talk about those cases as well, and then we can go up to the Civil War after.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I'm glad you mentioned these because they show the way that the security state and even the public state could be basically suborned by deep political power. So if we're going to go chronologically, the Barbary pirates, I don't have a whole lot to say about it, except for that it represented the interests of the U.S., a merchant capacity, right? Going in the Mediterranean, they were being kidnapped by these Barbary pirates in present-day Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, and then they would be held for ransom. And this was actually taking up a big chunk of the federal government's budget at the time, which was only really paid for through tariffs and the sale of Western land. And so they were just taking this money, and it was like a transfer payment to pirates. So kind of, it's not that hard to understand why Thomas Jefferson would have, even though he was a small government guy, he would have been like, okay, we've got to deal with this problem. But in the Western expansion of the U.S. and Andrew Jackson going into Florida, this is like Andrew Jackson is sent ostensibly to deal with like cross-border Indian raids, but he just goes ahead and goes into Florida and overthrows the Spanish colonial government there. And that leads to the U.S. This is something the U.S. does repeatedly, and they do this in the Mexican-American War too. But you basically fight a war over some territory, and you win the war, and then afterwards you give them some money as though it were some sort of deal that had been struck. And that was what happened with the Spanish, in this case, with Florida, and that's how the U.S. gets Florida. Now, the Texas case is interesting because it really does represent deep political power because it was done privately. Like, this was not an official venture of the United States government. This was people like Moses Austin, who bought a lot of land in Texas, and they wanted to establish, they brought in slaves as well, and it was sparsely populated. And so quickly they became like a big chunk, if not a majority of the population were Anglo settlers and wanting to set up slaves. So this is Texas, in the Alamo mythology is all really horrendous. And it was really a slavers, venture. And they even said, Sam Houston said that the Lone Star Republic brings glory to the Anglo-Saxon race. And this is a representation of what could be called the slave power. It was called the slave power in the United States. And so these people who were kind of, they could almost be called conspiracy theorists today, that wrote about how bad the slave power was in the South, and that slavery, the slave aristocracy in the South was behind a lot of atrocities. Like, for example, the murder of Zachary Taylor, president, who was apparently poisoned when he favored, he was against he was against the Compromise of 1850, but then he dies, and then the other guy flip-flops. Parenti has a really great essay on this. It seems pretty clear. Zach Taylor was poisoned by the slave power, which is really deep political power. It's political power without any sort of statutory or constitutional basis that nonetheless can be decisive. And here they apparently killed a president. And so this is deep political power, part of the deep political system. It wasn't carried out by some country. Well, it might have been an informal kind of intelligence organization that did it. But either way, this is something that is not sanctioned by the federal government and is operating this way. And the idea behind Texas and the settling of Texas, they went in and they declared a Lone Star Republic, but that only lasts for about a decade or so. And then James Polk comes in and annexes Texas. And the Southerners had plans to use Texas to break it into a bunch of smaller states so that they could have a majority in the Senate. And they could make sure that slavery was secure, because they were very obsessed with this idea of protecting the institution of slavery, because that was their livelihood. And so Polk, you have to believe that elements of the slave power were behind Texas, not just the people settling it themselves, that they wanted to break up Texas into smaller states and use it to extend their political domination in the U.S. and to secure their position in perpetuity. And then he fights the Mexican-American War, like 1845, 1846. And this is basically, after they annex Texas, there's a phony incident where there's a disputed territory and supposedly some kind of skirmish involving Zachary Taylor. And the U.S. uses this as a pretext to just attack all of the territory that Mexico has. So they basically take over California, and they sack Mexico City. They send people down, landing at about the exact same spot that Hernan Cortez landed, do the same march that Cortez did to Mexico City, but an even more dramatic outcome than for Cortez, because Cortez first had to retreat and then came back, and then everybody was dying of smallpox, etc. And so he was able to dominate, Tenochtitlan, right, the old Aztec capital. Zachary Taylor, 200 years later, almost 250 years later, goes through and marches that same path, forces Mexico to surrender, and they sign a deal with them, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it gives them $15 million for all those western states like Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, California, especially.
Half of Mexico.
Yeah, and the best. I mean, I don't mean to diss the rest of Mexico, but really the best half from an economic perspective, from a geographical perspective. And they give them $15 million, but which is the same amount that they gave the French for the Louisiana Purchase. But unlike the French case, this was not like a deal. This was like, we just sacked you, and here's $15 million, which to me shows that they knew that this was a dubious proposition. Like, they still had concepts of international sovereignty and so on. This is why Abe Lincoln at the time was in Congress, and he was saying, like, show me that. They called him Spotty Lincoln, because he was saying in Congress, show me the spot where this attack took place. He was actually against this war, and a lot of people were against this war, like Frederick Douglass and Henry David Thoreau went to jail. That was about this war. It was clearly a war of conquest that was illegitimate, but the U.S. did it anyway, and it was propelled by powerful actors that were more powerful than Congress and that were backing the person in the White House. And so you get this conundrum in politics in the United States, which is, even when something is done by a public official like James Polk, like, when is this done by interests that are in the private realm and not really related to democracy and the national interest understood that way? That's deep political power, and it propels the U.S. And U.S. policy oftentimes, even before this is institutionalized in a more formal imperial mechanism after World War II.
Well, going off this era a little bit still, Elihu Root, the Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State, he was also one of the founders of the International Court of Justice. But he kind of exemplifies how U.S. international policy plays out here, and specifically going back to something I talked about in terms of like the neutrality of the rules of the game. Very similarly, there's this sort of idea that U.S. property relations are universally applicable, And so he very explicitly writes, we have a right to specifically go into Mexico, China, and Cuba. But at the time, the main issues are expansion into China and building infrastructure there, investing there, and basically going beyond the traditional colonial relation of just kind of pillage or exact tribute out of people and actually invest and then try to get returns out of that, which is sort of the new capitalist form of imperialism. But he specifically says a, quote, minimum standard of treatment is expected of all foreign governments who are faced with U.S. investors trying to pour money into their country. And I think that's like a big turning point here is how we start to look globally, like we said, with the Spanish-American War, and it starts to expand out, and we eventually land in World War I. But specifically this principle of the U.S. property relations and the way that we think about capital accumulation and investment has a universal applicability. And whether or not you're under U.S. sovereignty, the U.S. sovereign applies to you out of some minimum standard of treatment, and that is some universal principle. And I think that's sort of not that the ideological backing matters that much in comparison to the material power relations here, but that gives people, again, like that matters. It acts as a force on them, as a story they can tell themselves to justify what they're doing as somehow, again, just like in Mexico, they're somehow aware of that maybe their claims can be a little bit, like you said, a little bit dubious. But I guess, Aaron, if you want to jump in there.
That brings a couple of good points, because the Spanish-American War, going from these aspects, dovetails naturally with the Spanish-American War and what that era represents. So in the United States, you had, they go from sea to shining sea, and this, by getting this with the Mexican-American War, they basically have gone from sea to shining sea. And it's notable that after taking over California and signing this treaty with Mexico, it's just a few years later that they send Admiral Perry into Tokyo Bay, Edo Bay, and this is a cataclysm for the Japanese. This really represents like the end of the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, because the shogun in Japan, his entire regime and legitimacy rested upon his military dominance. And when it was clear that these quote unquote barbarians were not going to leave them alone, because they knew what had happened with the Opium Wars and so on, it was just Japan was kind of lucky because they were remote and they didn't have a lot of valuable resources. So they kind of got left alone. And that when the U.S. saw how much money there was to be made in Asia, they wanted to go over there. And California, that was part of the motivation to actually get California, was trade with the Pacific, which is, of course, a huge part up to the present day. And wanting to dominate the Pacific and commerce in the Pacific is still a huge deal for the United States. And, this helps to explain all this business with China and also what we do in World War II. But they send Admiral Perry in to force the Japanese to sign unfavorable treaties to the United States, with the United States. And it leads to the whole reformation of Japanese society and their industrialization. And basically they copy the U.S. and Western imperialism themselves. But the point that I want to get is that right away they wanted to expand commercially in pretty imperialistic ways. And this is still like 4 decades before the Spanish-American War, which launches in 1898. But so you have this expedition and some brief moves towards trying to do more in the Pacific, but really things in America had to be settled first. The question of slavery was going to play out, the Civil War. And then once that does, though, you have the Reconstruction era and the Gilded Age, it's kind of coterminously, but sometimes they're put as like first Reconstruction and then the Gilded Age. But really this sort of corporate development is also taking place during the Reconstruction era and further settlement to the West. And by the end of the 19th century, you have the closing of the frontier. The fact that there's no more Western expansion, that it's all settled. The Indians are really no longer a threat in any serious way. And the Transcontinental Railroad is built. And the U.S. is now really a continental empire. And but there were, with the frontier, with the end of the frontier, you have the frontier's functions no longer serving, because the frontier, the fact that it wasn't always settled, was useful for American elites. It dealt with surplus labor and other contradictions in the economy and in the capitalist system. You could always light out for the West. If things were bad and the only options available were unattractive in these cities, and cities were overcrowded and people were miserable. You could always go to the West and farm and have some escape valve that way and a pressure valve. But with the end of the frontier, you have crises in America, economic crises, different panics. They're like the panic of whatever year, in the late 1800s, and different financial problems, brought on by problems with capitalism. And there was a question of what you were going to do. You could try to accept the rise of labor in the United States and use its strength to foster more consumption and thus more production, and sort of solidify capitalist production that way, and wealth and profits to a degree, but also boosted by consumption of the workers in America. Or you could go abroad and seek markets elsewhere and seek to dominate the resources of other regions, and let that sort of process take the place of what the frontier used to do. And this is a major thesis of American diplomatic history, the closing of the frontier thesis. It's really famous for the Wisconsin school, William Appleman Williams. We can get more into this at a later point. But the point is that at around 1898, when the Spanish-American War breaks out, we've already annexed Hawaii a couple of years earlier, which is part of the same phenomenon. And this represents the victory of economic elites in shaping the way America would go, domestic production and prosperity or empire.
I think this point is so crucial because there is this notion that you sometimes hear from liberals that the U.S. is not an empire, right? You mentioned, Obama claims that the United States doesn't expand. Well, first of all, that's absurd when we see the neo-colonialist policies that the U.S. carries out around the world in terms of coups and all those meddling operations. That's obvious. But also, okay, yeah, the U.S. is not territorially expanding now, but it continued to territorially expand right up into the 20th century. I mean, you mentioned the annexation of Hawaii, and of course, Puerto Rico is still a colony, but even statehood, the idea of 50 states is very recent. It's 100 years, less than 100 years old. So what's interesting for me is I think you really hit the nail on the head in this book in arguing that, as you write here, at the turn of the century, this is the 19th century, with manifest destiny and the closing of the frontier finally achieved, the U.S. began to project its power globally. So by establishing this territorial contiguous empire, although, Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands are not contiguous, but the seed-assigning she territorial empire, then the U.S. began expanding internationally in a way that's not unlike the European empires. But the thing is, the liberals who claim that the U.S. doesn't have an empire like the European empires, well, yeah, it is different. It's this era of neocolonialism, as Nkrumah articulated it. But that's because that empire, that European-style empire, was already consolidated in the 18th and 19th centuries. And right. 20th. But go ahead, Seamus.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I think with us talking about the end of the frontier here, as we already talked about, the big inflection point is, do we just expand outward into the global south like the European empires did, or do we also assert dominance over the European, the former colonial powers? And that is really what shapes into the unipolar world in that era. So kind of as like a last point to close out here, Aaron, if you want to talk a little bit, since we talked about up to World War One, the deep political system has been pretty embedded in American politics. As you talk about in the book, local political machines are really where that starts to be institutionalized. But then you also point out that J.P. Morgan and his cronies, for lack of a better word, pushed the U.S. to abandon its neutrality for its own interests in World War I. And then on the other side of the war, you wrote about, and you just mentioned earlier, how they imposed debts at the Treaty of Versailles on the European powers. And it's not just that they imposed debts that led to the Great Depression, but as the economist Michael Hudson has written, that's a pretty intentional choice that they knew that the European powers would, A, default on it, and B, that it would destabilize their economy, because it's impossible to keep your balance of payments at all stabilized when you have that level of debt payments going out to the U.S. And to U.S. banks, which were already sopping up all of the deposit-inducing basically London as a financial center collapsed in World War I because they had to freeze all of their short-term interest rate arbitrage. It's a whole different issue, but essentially, like, the power has transferred already to New York, and it continues to suck all of the wealth out of the European powers. So, in terms of it being an intentional destabilization, I think the idea was it would happen at any cost, whether or not they knew exactly what that cost would be in terms of leading to World War II and the Great Depression. So how does all of this play out, coming from the closing of the frontier and culminating in the institutionalization at the federal level with the Cold War and everything? How does this transfer into a federal and global level institutionalization of the U.S. deep state?
Well, we'll go over some of these in later chapters in greater detail, but the shorter answer is that the U.S., we've mentioned the Spanish-American War, and let's think about what that actually did. The U.S. is supposedly, when you brought up how Elihu Root said something about a standard, minimum standard of treatment, I would guess that was a reference to the Spanish situation in Cuba, because the pretext for the Spanish-American War was actually that the Cuban colony, the Spanish domination of Cuba and occupation was so brutal that the U.S. was justified to intervene. And so that, I would guess, is what's behind somebody like Root talking about minimum standards of treatment, because you kind of wonder, why would he even really be saying that? That doesn't go along with this sort of commercial fundamentalism. But, it's a reference to what the Spanish were really doing. But when that war begins, the first shots, as I recall, are fired in Manila Bay, which is, if you look on a map, very far from Havana, okay, from Cuba. It's the East Indies versus the West Indies, you could say, more or less. And so this is notable that the U.S. already has these designs going back to like Admiral Perry going into Tokyo Bay, and then, with this seizing this Philippine colony, which the U.S. took for a long time.
Yeah, very quick note. I want you to continue that thought, but just as a journalist, I should mention that, of course, the Spanish-American War is also what gives birth to yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst, who becomes this media tycoon, the kind of original version of Rupert Murdoch, he gets his start, at least he becomes very well known for promoting basically fake news and propaganda, promoting the U.S. Side of the Spanish-American War, sensationalizing. I mean, obviously the Spanish colonialists were horrible, but sensationalizing all of this to promote the interests of the U.S. empire. So it also shows, just to get another element, it shows the role of the media as well in all of this, when we're talking about the deep political system and the role of media propaganda and helping to lubricate all those operations.
And note also that the Hearst fortune was not, he wasn't the guy who's like, I want to sell newspapers and make great newspapers. He got a ton of money from his father, who was involved in gold mines, etc. So if you ever have seen Deadwood, the great series on HBO, George Hearst is, I believe, the actual father of William Randolph Hearst. And he's, fictionalized version of him, but more or less accurate in terms of showing his monomaniacal pursuit of gold and wealth, which is what William Randolph Hearst had. So he didn't pull himself up by his own bootstraps. He had a whole lot of money and then promoted his own and his class's interests with his media empire. And that's a recurring theme in capitalist societies. Now, the Spanish-American War is the U.S. still does. They're confused about what to do with these places, because part of the American mythology is all about not being an empire and being opposed to the old world empires, which is it's contradictory because the U.S. practices imperialism, but they like to have anti-imperialist posture. And so with the Philippines, there's a lot of opposition to this. The Anti-Imperialist League emerges over the question of the Philippines. They basically give Cuba fake independence, meaning that they're supposed to have like a puppet government, or a government. They don't call it a puppet one. And then the Platt Amendment and other acts allowed the U.S. or gave the U.S. congressional authorization to intervene in Cuban politics at any point. And Cuba had to sign this treaty that the U.S. would be allowed to intervene militarily whenever they wanted, which is not really sovereignty at all. But then the U.S. could be like, well, we're not an empire because they're not a colony. But okay, well, whatever. Now, the Philippines, this was a question for McKinley. Was he going to annex it or not? And he ultimately decides to annex it. And the idea, this is when the English are saying, take on the white man's burden. And McKinley says, well, I talked to God all night and he told me I needed to annex them. We can't let the Spanish have it again. And we got to help our little brown brothers. This was like, I think that Taft was actually the one who used that phrase, but this is all of a piece with the little brown brothers, white man's burden as a sort of rationalization for to justify U.S. colonialism in the Philippines, even though it was only supposed to be temporary. But this goes right into the open door policy, which when you said that Elihu Root was talking about the universality of American, liberal commercial conventions, this is really the open door policy of Secretary of State John Hay is most famous for this. And people have argued reasonably that the open door is basically a microcosm of American foreign policy when it comes to commerce, that every country there must be a door to other countries and it must be open. And the Boxer Rebellion is an example of what this means in practice. When there was anti-foreign sentiment in China, and you have the Boxer Uprising because of just how the Western powers have immiserated this once very powerful and wealthy Chinese empire. You have a thug buddy alliance, really, of like Germans, Americans, French, British, all teaming up to crush this Boxer Rebellion and really brutalize these people. They were tortured or executed after the fact. And they also saddled the Chinese with these huge debts that they would have to pay off. Like, they never paid them off. They basically write them off in World War II because they're an ally against Japan. But they ended up paying like trillions of dollars worth of gold because of the Boxer Rebellion to the Western countries. So, what the U.S. has done to China is just horrendous. But this open door policy is presented as like an open door sounds very benign, and free trade sounds like a nice thing. And shouldn't we all be free to trade? But what does this really mean in practice? For U.S. people, they don't know because their leaders euphemize it. But for people in China and the global South, they understand what this means, and it's not friendly, and it's not something that's consensual and mutually beneficial. It's imperialism, and the U.S. pursues more of this internationally, and it gets more entangled in international affairs, and this leads to World War I, where the U.S. is supposed to be neutral, but they're really backing the Brits. And the Secretary of State resigns over this, William Jennings Bryan, because Woodrow Wilson is backing the British more. But the British are getting they're being loaned money by J.P. Morgan. And after this war, the debts are huge. But Morgan, for whatever reason, it's like economic fundamentalism about debt. Instead of forgiving your allies' debts, which they can't pay, the U.S. keeps them in place. And the only way to allow this system to work, so the U.S. actually puts not Germany in debt, but the Allies in debt. And the Allies put Germany in debt. And so Germany has to pay the Allies, but the Allies have to collect money from Germany because the Allies have to pay the U.S. Michael Hudson does a great job explaining this, and he's a brilliant guy on all these issues.
And really, really quickly, Aaron, yeah, I do want to talk more about that. We should definitely talk about World War I. It's so crucial in this because it's kind of the like the prequel to the Bretton Woods system, and we see the beginning of the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson and all this. But just before we move away from the Spanish-American War and move toward World War I, we talk about the open door policy. I think we also should see this as kind of the way I see the open door policy is like good cop, bad cop, where the Europeans were the bad cop and the U.S. tried to be pretended to be the good cop, right? But they're working, as you said, they're working together. But, this comes just a decade after the Berlin Conference, in which the European powers quite literally carved up Africa. They had a map and they just picked who would get what part of Africa. And then that's essentially what they were doing to China. And then the U.S. comes with the open door policy while the European powers are carving up China. And the U.S. says, we have this open door policy, which is supposed to be the preferable alternative to the Europeans carving it up, but it's a way of helping to facilitate the European colonialists carving up China. So it's exactly a kind of good cop, bad cop policy, and that leads us to World War I because W.E. Du Bois has this famous essay, "The African Roots of the War," in which he argues, I think, largely correctly. Maybe he overstates his argument a little bit, but he argues that the carving up of Africa in the Berlin Conference and the European intercolonialist conflict over Africa was what helped fuel the rise of the conditions that led to World War I. And I would extend that to simply saying a battle over the colonies, right? Not just Africa, but essentially this kind of good cop, bad cop policy that the U.S. was playing, it no longer worked by 1914, and it exploded in these internal contradictions of the battle in between different colonialist powers.
Yes, these are all good points, and especially want to thank you for making me think about the open door, because as you were saying this is directly correlated to what you were saying, and I don't necessarily want to get too deep in details because some of these history aspects come up in later chapters, and I'm assuming we're going to talk about them more deeply. But the other thing about the open door that I wanted to mention was that it did represent a revision of the sort of status quo internationally between the U.S. and the European powers. So I said that the U.S. demanded to have open access to these places in China and so on. But what I omitted, but which you made me remember, is that it was really about the spheres of influence that these other places had declared around China in the wake of the Opium Wars and so on. The U.S. was saying, okay, it's now going to be like free for all. We are going to all be able to gang up on China, and we're not going to have specific spheres of influence. So this is an early example of the U.S. asserting its global management, or attempting to assert its global management over international commerce, and making the Europeans kind of accommodate them, which they are successful to some extent, although you still have these colonial empires in World War I and World War II, and it doesn't. So the U.S. Those elements of the U.S. that really wanted to revise the international status quo they don't really take over the American system and the American government until World War II. They finally do. In World War I, they are entangled with Europe, but they're not able to come to a resolution that gives them what they really want, and thus you still have more imperial competition, which is what World War II really was. And Du Bois is
World War One.
Well, in
World War II as well, but
in World War II. So that's what I'm getting at in World War. But if you're talking about Du Bois saying that about World War One, and he famously he actually supported World War One for a time, and then came to, I think, regret that. But
it was a formative experience in his political development, and he continued to move to the left after that.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say that the African imperial part is very, very relevant and a big cause. But perhaps even more decisive would be the Berlin-Baghdad Railway and the threat posed by German hegemony over the Balkans, and thus the Middle East and Baku, where not Baku, but around Basra, you had massive oil deposits discovered that was really freaking out the British, because a railroad would get around the Suez Canal, and that this is a big factor in World War I as being derived from this competition of empires. And the U.S. enters in a dubious way, backing one side, pretending to be neutral, and they leave a bad situation in terms of unpayable debts that cannot but lead to World War II eventually. And they rewrite. What's interesting to think about this time period is the way that American business elites rewrote the history to suit their purposes of World War I. So people like Dean Acheson and other people after World War II, they were saying that economic nationalism was the cause of the Depression and thus World War II, right? So what are they leaving out? Well, they're leaving out the unpayable debts that their own class of economic elites insisted stay in place, which were unpayable. And that was the reason. If you need to earn foreign currency, so you put tariffs up in order to avoid having your country flooded with cheap imports to support your own industry. And but it's done to pay debts that you have to pay that are in another currency. And so but they omit that part, and they just say, oh, it must have been the tariffs. But the tariffs were just a response, and the economic nationalism was just a response to unpayable debts. And this debt issue is a huge part of capitalism, and has to be seen as a huge weapon, or maybe one of the top weapons for the prevailing economic elites in our system, is that they can put you into debt that compounds, annually, and you end up peonizing people and whole countries through this mechanism. And they were so rapacious with it in the wake of World War One that it gave rise to the Depression in World War Two, because they couldn't divorce themselves from this sort of sacrosanctity of debt mentality that they have.
Okay, so as we've already talked about, I mean, the unsustainable debts that were kind of saddled on the Allies and then passed on through them to Germany destabilized Europe and set the stage for the Great Depression and then World War II. So, Aaron, if you just want to close us out here, go over how we get from the settlement at the Treaty of Versailles, which is sort of presided over by J.P. Morgan and similar U.S. financial interests, and how that lands us all the way up at the start of World War II.
So the way that it plays out in the United States, you have the end of World War II. The end of World War One, and it's a tumultuous period because you have a lot of dramatic things that happen besides this craziness of World War One, which was a slaughter on a scale never really seen before, and it kind of belied all the notions of progress that had been circulating in the Western world for the preceding couple of decades. And you have this Spanish flu, which kills a whole lot of people, millions and millions of people. It's worse in Asia, but it also hits the U.S. and Europe. And you have also the revolution, which took place in Russia, as a result of the war and the destabilization to Russian society caused by World War One, and also their defeat to the Japanese in 1905. And so you have you have something else in the quasi-Western world, which is this communist regime now that is fearful for people. And when Americans came back from the war and they were expecting more prosperity, but there was kind of economic slump and other problems, this leads to the so-called Red Summer, where there's a lot of labor unrest all across America. And the deep political establishment of the United States, they have the Palmer raids. They basically deport people like Bill Haywood and Emma Goldman and persecute the American left and really wipe them out. This is the beginning of the deep political systems, organized systematic violence and suppression of radical forces, that are socialist, more or less. And so the right is ascendant, and in American politics, it's a conservative era. And the 1920s are a time of, profiteering and lawlessness, and the whole scheme they set up post World War One is really the U.S. loans money to Germany so that Germany can pay the Allies, so that the Allies can pay the U.S. And to do that, you have to make you have to have easy credit available in the U.S. So you have Bank of England and Federal Reserve policies of easy credit, which leads to enormous speculation in the stock market, massive profiteering in the stock market based on speculation, and gangsterism running amok in the U.S. because of prohibition, but prohibition taking place alongside a kind of economic, financialized bubble boom, and you have the organized crime and other financial elites making lots and lots of money off of all of this, off of the speculation, but also off of alcohol and prohibition, and this all comes crashing down when the Fed and the Bank of England decides that they're going to take away the punch bowl and raise interest rates. And then this causes the Great Depression, big economic collapse. Different countries respond differently. The U.S. responds because labor, I believe because labor is so powerful in the United States at this point in time, and radicalism in labor was more pronounced than before, even with the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, you still had pretty radical movements. For whatever reasons, the U.S. establishment, enough of them back democratic forces, and you get the New Deal in the U.S., and this wasn't without its discontents. So you had people like Morgan and Prescott Bush and the DuPonts, and they actually wanted to overthrow Roosevelt with their own kind of deep state, nascent deep state, embryonic deep state actors, but they didn't really have the power to do it. Roosevelt won out, and the New Deal prevails in the U.S., but fascism prevails in other countries. So, and they're backed by the people like Morgans and Rockefellers and so on, even as Rockefeller was also tight with the FDR. Yeah. The
Prescott Bush.
Yeah. Yep. So these are ways that the different countries deal with the Depression. You have fascism in Italy and Germany and Spain. And you have this sort of welfare capitalism where you have a bigger welfare state to try to deal with the problems, but it's so weak that the New Deal just sort of acts as a tourniquet It doesn't have the massive mobilization of the economy and of industry that World War II would provide. But you did have this New Deal regime emerge in the U.S. And we go into more detail about this later. But when World War II breaks out, in the U.S., the establishment of the U.S., even with the most progressive regime the U.S. has ever had, like FDR and Henry Wallace as vice president, they decide to allow the Rockefellers and this, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Council on Foreign Relations to receive State Department approval to plan U.S. entry into World War II and the post-war world. And this is where, in a top-down fashion, who even knows how involved FDR was in this decision, but you had the drafting of plans for the U.S. to enter and win in World War II and to do something different than they did after World War I, and that is to obtain the mantle of hegemony over global capitalism once they had secured the peace after the war. And this was the decision that was ultimately made, which was very fateful for the U.S. to cross the Rubicon and become a global empire and seek hegemony over global capitalism. And this is what we're dealing with today, the later stages of this whole project.
Yeah, and as we said in part one, there are a lot of topics in post-World War II history that we're going to cover in very great detail. So we are going to end part two here, and we did have in 1 hour we tried to cover 200 years of history. I mean, even more. But of course, this is where you argue, and I think correctly, Aaron, this is where this moment of World War II and the post-World War II era, when the deep state really becomes formative in determining U.S. policy. Of course, this is when key institutions in the deep state are created, or institutions that work with the deep state, especially, the CIA is created out of the SS and OSS. Not there's a little interesting historical rhyme there between the SS and the OSS. But anyway, so I know we'll be doing future episodes focused on Bretton Woods. That's a huge part of your book. Focused on the Korean War. Focused on, of course, Vietnam, Bay of Pigs, JFK, all of that history that is, of course, after World War II. But I think that was a really good overview in as brief of amount of time what we could of the 18th and 19th centuries, and we'll focus a lot more on the 20th centuries. I don't know if you wanted to add something else, Seamus, before we conclude here.
I think this was great. I'm excited for covering the rest of this series.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. This is great to be able to talk about this stuff after spending years and years writing all of this. It's really awesome, and I'm so glad you guys are doing this with me. And it's fun already, even though these things are kind of long. I'm pretty amped up just from sitting and talking about this. So this is really cool, and thanks a lot, gentlemen.
Yeah, and I'll say, I guess maybe at the end of these episodes, we should kind of do like a little hint of what the subsequent part will be. Like, all these TV shows do that. I guess they used to do that. They don't really do that anymore. But I guess so. The next part will probably be talking about different analyses of imperialism, your idea of hegemony versus empire, and different scholarship in terms of foreign policy and international relations. We'll try to keep it more interesting and not boring and academic. But I think in part three, when we talk about analysis of imperialism, I think that'll be really important to help situate our future analysis, especially after World War II, to understand, what imperialism actually is.
Yeah, and specifically how U.S. academia can't cope with it, because everybody that's been to college and taken history and social science courses, you're thinking like, why do I not know anything about the U.S. as an empire when it's like the overriding fact of political and economic life, and I don't even really understand it. Why is that? So we're going to try to answer that question.